The Name 3, 17th of January 1962, Part 1 of 4. I don't think that, as paradoxical at first glance as the symbolization with which I ended my discourse last time may seem, using the mathematical symbol of the square root of -1 as the basis of the subject, I don't think that everything in that can have been a complete surprise for you. I mean that if we remind ourselves of the Cartesian thought process itself, one cannot forget the point to which this thought process brings its author. There he is, having taken a positive step forwards towards the truth. What is more, this truth is in no way, for him as for us, placed in brackets, as a dimension to be distinguished from reality. This truth towards which Descartes advances with his conquering step, it is very much the truth about the thing in itself. And what does this bring us to? To a process of emptying the world right up to the point at which there is nothing left but this void that is called extension. How is that possible? You know that, as an example, he is going to choose to melt a block of wax. Is it by accident that he chooses this material? Or is it not because he is drawn to it, because that is the ideal matter with which to receive the divine seal, the divine imprint? Yet, after this quasi-alchemical operation that he does in front of us, he is going to make it fade away, to be reduced to being nothing but the pure extension of substance. No longer anything on which can be printed that which is precisely elided in his thought process. There is no longer any relation between the signifier and any natural trace, if I may express myself thus, and very notably the natural trace par excellence that constitutes the imagined body. Which is not to say that this imaginary can be radically repudiated, but it is separated from the signifying game. It is what it is, a bodily effect, and as such recused as a witness to any truth. Nothing can be done with it but to live it through this imaginary theory of passions, but not in any way as something to be thought with. Man thinks with a discourse reduced to the evidence produced by what is called the light of nature, meaning an algebra, a logistical group that henceforth could have been different if God had wanted it to be, theory of passions. What Descartes could not yet perceive is that we can want it in his place, i.e. that some 150 years after his death, set theory was born, which would have brought it about, in which even the digits 1 and 0 are only the objects of literal definitions, of purely formal axiomatic definitions as neutral elements. He could have done away with the need for a truthful God, a deceiving God only being possible if he cheated in the very resolution of equations. But no one has ever realized this. There is no miracle of combination except for the meaning that we give it. It is already suspect each time that we give it a meaning. That is why the word exists, but not the God of Descartes. In order for Descartes' God to exist, we would have to have the tiny beginning of a proof of his own creative will in the domain of mathematics. And yet it is not him that invented Cantor's transfinite numbers, it's us. This is definitely why history shows us that the great mathematicians who opened up this realm that is beyond divine logic, Euler the very first, were very afraid. They knew what they were doing. They were encountering not the substantial void of the Cartesian project, which in the end, despite Pascal, no longer scares anyone, because we are encouraged to live with going further and further, but the void of the other, an infinitely more formidable place, since there has to be someone there. This is why, holding more tightly onto the question of the meaning of the subject, such as it is evoked in the Cartesian meditation, I don't think I can do anything about that. even if I am encroaching into a domain that has been gone over so many times that it has ended up seeming to have become the protected reserve of the few, I don't believe I am doing something that they can be disengaged from, even for them, insofar as the question is current, more current than any other, and even more current, I think I can prove it, in psychoanalysis than anywhere else. The direction in which I am going to take you today is towards a consideration not of the origins, but of the position of the subject. Insofar as at the root of the act of speech there is something, a moment where it is inserted into a language structure, and that this language structure, insofar as it is characterized at this original point, I am trying to be clearer about it, to define it around a thematic that, in a graphical way, is incarnated in, entails the idea of an original contemporaneity of writing and language themselves, insofar as writing is signifying connotation, speech did not create it so much as read it. The genesis of the signifier at the specific level of the real, which is one of its axes or roots, is no doubt for us the principal way of connoting the coming to light of its effects, the so-called effect of meaning. In this, the subject's first relation, in what he projects behind her him, nachtraglich, simply by the fact of engaging with her his own speech, stammering to begin with, then ludic, even befuddled, in the general shared discourse. What he projects behind her his act, it's there that this something is produced, towards which we have the courage to go into, in order to question it in the name of the formula wo es wahr soll ich werden, which we would tend to push towards the formula with a very slightly different emphasis, in the sense of an already having been, of a gewesen, that subsists as long as the subject, going forward with it, cannot pass over the need to do the job of a profound double backing of her his position in order for it to be graspable. Already here, something pushes us towards something that, to be reversed, suggests to us the remark that to oneself all along, in one's existence, negation has never not harboured a question. What does it assume? Does it assume the affirmation which it draws on? No doubt. But this affirmation, is it itself simply the affirmation of something real that would then be taken away? It is not without surprise, nor without malice, that we can find from the pen of Bergson a few lines with which he opposes any idea of nothingness, a position that fits very well with a philosophy that is fundamentally bound up with a kind of naive realism. Bergson writes, "There is more and not less in the idea of an object conceived as not existing than in the idea of this same object conceived as existing. For the idea of the object not existing is necessarily the idea of the object existing with, in addition, the representation of an exclusion of this object by the actual reality taken in block." Is it thus that we can be content ourselves to position it? For a moment, let's bring our attention towards the negation itself. Is it thus that we can content ourselves with the simple experience of its usage, of the job it fulfills, to position the effects of it? To guide you in this area, by all the routes of linguistic inquiry, is something that we cannot refuse to do. Besides, have we not already advanced in this direction? And if you remember well, the allusion was made on this a good while ago, in the certainly very suggestive, if not illuminating work of Pichon and Damoret. in their collaboration on a grammatical study that is very rich and a very fruitful read. A grammatical study of the French language in particular, in which their comments end up stating that there is not, they say, correctly speaking, negation in French. They mean that this form, simplified according to their meaning of radical ablation, such as it is expressed in the overthrow of certain German phrases, I understand it as an overthrow because it is definitely the term nicht that, coming in a surprising way at the end of the phrase that has been constructed in a positive register, has allowed the auditor to remain in the most perfectly undetermined state right up until the end, and fundamentally in the position of being due something which is crossed out by this nicht, all the signification of the phrase being found to be excluded. Excluded from what? From the field of admissibility to truth. Pichon comments, not without pertinence, that the division, the skits, the most common way the negation functions in French between a ne on the one hand and the auxiliary word the pas, not, the personne, no one, the rien, nothing, the mie, not a crumb, the goutte, not a drop, that occupies the position in the enunciating phrase that is left to give precision in relation to the ne, which is named to start with. That this suggests to us, in studying the separated usage that can be made of it closely, namely to attribute to one of these functions a signification called discordancy, and to the other an exclusionary signification. It is precisely exclusion from the real that the pas, the point, is charged with, whilst the ne expresses this dissonance, sometimes so subtly that it is nothing but a shadow, and namely in this infamous ne that you know I made a special point of trying for the first time precisely to show that there is something there, something of the trace of the subject of the unconscious, the so-called ne expletive in Je crains qu'il ne vienne, which translates as I'm afraid that he will come. You can just about touch with your fingertips that this means nothing other than I was hoping that he would come. It expresses the discordance of your own feelings in relation to this coming. In some way, it's a vehicle for a much more suggestive trace to be incarnated in its signifier, i.e., what we call ambivalence in psychoanalysis. Je crains qu'il ne vienne. This is not so much an expression of the ambiguity of our feeling as, through this overload, a way of showing how, in a certain kind of link, something that is capable of resurfacing, of emerging, of being reproduced, of making its mark in a gap, which is this distinction between the subject of the act of enunciation as such, in relation to the subject of the énoncé, even if it is not present at the level of the énoncé in a way that designates it as such. Je crains qu'il ne vienne, it's a third party. What would it be if what was said was Je crains que je ne fasse, I'm afraid that I will do it? Something that is hardly ever said, let alone thinkable. Who would be at the level of the énoncé? However, this is of little importance. You can see, though, that I can get it in here, at the level of the énoncé. And a subject, masked or not at the level of the enunciation, represented or not, brings us to thinking about the question of the function of the subject, of its form, of what it is based on, what indicates it, in the moment that defines the present as the one who conveys this speech act.